The sincere Christian who views himself as a good person and a deep thinker often encounters the accusation that opposition to mass immigration or unrestricted charity toward non-citizens constitutes racism. Such claims frame any preference for the household, community, or nation as moral failing. Yet the full scriptural witness presents a consistent pattern of ordered love that begins with one's own and extends outward through discernment rather than indiscriminate openness. Jesus' earthly ministry focused first on the lost sheep of the house of Israel, a covenantal priority that reflected God's election of a particular people for a specific redemptive purpose rather than universal exclusion based on modern racial categories. The intelligent believer recognizes that this focus was not hatred of Gentiles but the strategic unfolding of salvation history, culminating in the Great Commission to all nations after the resurrection. Labeling this as racism misapplies a contemporary political term to ancient covenant theology, ignoring the distinction between divinely ordained particularism and sinful prejudice. Biblical narratives repeatedly affirm God's choice of Israel as his treasured possession, with commands to maintain distinct identity, borders, and inheritance among the tribes while treating the resident alien with justice when they lived within the community under the law. These instructions formed part of a larger framework of stewardship, where the people of God preserved their distinct calling amid surrounding nations. Godly figures such as Abraham, Moses, and David operated within this structure, showing faithfulness to their own while extending hospitality or justice where appropriate. The sincere Christian who reflects deeply on these accounts understands that in-group priorities serve divine purposes of preservation and witness, not arbitrary superiority. Accusations of racism against today's immigration skeptics therefore collapse when examined against this scriptural pattern, revealing instead a call to wise boundaries that protect the vulnerable already present. Opposition to uncontrolled immigration aligns with this biblical realism by prioritizing the household and nation God has placed under one's care, consistent with the command to provide first for one's own relatives. The good person motivated by heavenly reward sees that stewardship requires evaluating fruits, demographic strain, crime, fiscal burdens, and cultural erosion, rather than yielding to platitudes that equate discernment with hatred. Human limits, including finite resources and responsibilities to children and native communities, make unbounded openness unsustainable. By rejecting mass inflows and supporting repatriation where necessary, the intelligent Christian exercises the wisdom Jesus commanded, redirecting charity toward effective aid in origin countries. This approach fulfills love of neighbor without compromising the order that sustains long-term good. Biblical particularism and the misuse of the racism label. Scripture presents God's election of Israel as a covenantal act of grace for the blessing of all nations, not a model of modern racial animus. Jesus stated that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel during his earthly ministry, directing his teaching and miracles primarily toward his own people as the fulfillment of Old Testament promises. This particular focus reflected the progressive revelation of redemption rather than exclusionary prejudice against Gentiles, who received inclusion through the post-resurrection commission to disciple all peoples. The deep-thinking believer distinguishes this divine strategy from contemporary racism, recognizing that the term distorts ancient realities when applied retroactively. Opponents who equate immigration restriction with racism ignore this context, conflating prudent national stewardship with sin. Godly figures throughout the Bible exhibited strong in-group loyalty while remaining faithful to the Lord. Abraham separated from surrounding peoples to preserve the covenant line. Moses enforced boundaries around the tabernacle and inheritance laws to maintain tribal distinctions, and prophets warned against intermarriage with idolatrous nations to protect spiritual purity. These actions, recorded as obedience rather than vice, demonstrate that particularism served covenant fidelity and communal integrity. The sincere Christian who considers himself intelligent sees that similar reasoning applies today. Opposition to demographic replacement through mass immigration preserves the cohesion and prosperity that enable effective charity. Such positions do not deny the image of God in every person but affirm ordered responsibilities that begin locally. Claims that biblical particularism justifies open borders fail under scrutiny because Scripture consistently upholds national distinctions and boundaries as part of God's design. The Tower of Babel account shows God scattering peoples into separate languages and territories, while Acts 17 verse 26 affirms that he determined the allotted periods and boundaries of nations. The good person motivated by salvation understands that ignoring these realities under the banner of anti-racism produces the very harms, eroded trust, strained resources, and imported conflicts that undermine the capacity for genuine neighborly love. Stewardship, therefore, requires boundaries that honor both divine order and human limits. Godly figures, in-group priorities, and scriptural reasoning. Historical figures revered as faithful in Scripture routinely practiced forms of particularism that protected their own people without descending into the hatred associated with modern racism. Joshua and the judges maintained strict separation from Canaanite nations to prevent idolatry, while kings like Hezekiah and Josiah enforced reforms that reinforced covenant identity against foreign influences. These leaders acted in obedience to commands that distinguished Israel from surrounding groups, viewing such distinctions as essential to their calling as a light to the Gentiles. The intelligent Christian applies this pattern by recognizing that today's resistance to unchecked immigration flows from the same stewardship impulse, preserving the distinct character of the host society so it can continue offering effective help rather than dissolving into chaos. The authors of the biblical texts, inspired yet writing within their historical contexts, recorded laws and narratives that reinforced ethnic and national boundaries as part of God's will. Deuteronomy instructs Israel to drive out certain nations and to avoid intermarriage in order to remain holy, while Ezra and Nehemiah later enforced separation from foreign wives to restore purity after exile. These accounts portray such actions as righteous responses to covenant breach rather than arbitrary bigotry. The sincere believer who reflects on these examples concludes that racism accusations against immigration skeptics misuse the term, as biblical reasoning prioritizes covenant community and ordered love over universal dissolution of distinctions. Opposition to mass immigration follows this logic by safeguarding the nation's ability to function as a steward of resources and witness. Reasoning behind these scriptural patterns centers on preservation of identity for redemptive purposes, not superiority for its own sake. God chose Israel to model holiness and to bring blessing to all families of the earth, requiring temporary particularism until the fullness of time. The good Christian who desires to be intelligent and faithful sees parallel application today. Maintaining national boundaries prevents the loss of social capital and institutional capacity that makes charity sustainable. This is not hatred but prudent discernment that aligns with the full biblical witness, countering the charge of racism by grounding policy in stewardship rather than emotion. Applying biblical wisdom to modern immigration and charity. The accusation of racism leveled against those who favor repatriation or restricted immigration collapses when measured against biblical realism about human nature, group differences, and ordered responsibilities. Jesus' initial focus on Israel did not preclude later Gentile inclusion. Similarly, today's preference for citizens and legal residents does not deny the dignity of outsiders but insists on vetting, assimilation, and sustainable aid. The deep thinker recognizes that mass inflows from incompatible cultural frameworks import challenges, unknown motives, welfare dependency, crime, that Scripture warns against through calls to test spirits and guard the flock. Supporting deportation and audits of fraudulent entries restores integrity without violating compassion. Racism as a modern ideological weapon fails to justify open borders because Scripture itself affirms distinctions that serve higher purposes. The good person who pursues heavenly reward understands that true charity respects human limits and prioritizes the household, as commanded in 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. Redirecting church resources toward missions abroad while sending illegal and non-citizen immigrants home fulfills the Great Commission more effectively than domestic overload. This approach demonstrates moral depth by weighing fruits, demographic stability, economic recovery, restored trust, over performative gestures that harm native children and communities. In debate, the counter to racism claims rests on the distinction between sinful prejudice and biblically grounded particularism. Opposition to this form of charity protects the very society that enables generous outreach, aligning with God's design for nations and the finite nature of human existence. The intelligent Christian therefore embraces these positions as responsible stewardship, communicating that genuine goodness requires wisdom alongside compassion. By rejecting mass immigration's harms and supporting orderly repatriation, believers honor the full scriptural call rather than selective platitudes. Conclusion: Biblical wisdom on immigration. Stewardship versus racism accusations. Biblical particularism and ordered love provide the framework for understanding why opposition to mass immigration does not equate to racism but reflects responsible Christian discernment. The sincere believer who sees himself as a good person and deep thinker integrates Jesus' example of focused ministry with the broader witness that upholds boundaries, stewardship, and protection of the household. Accusations of racism serve as rhetorical tools that ignore scriptural patterns of covenant election, national distinctions, and prudent charity, while the fruits of unrestricted inflows, strain on resources, erosion of cohesion, and exploitation, contradict genuine love of neighbor. Repatriation, audits of fraudulent entries, and redirection of aid abroad restore balance, enabling the church to fulfill its mission sustainably. This path honors human limits and divine order, transforming potential exhaustion into enduring good. The intelligent Christian recognizes that such measures protect the innocent already present while extending effective help where it can produce lasting fruit. Stewardship in this context stands as the wise, faithful response that aligns personal goodness with the full teachings of Scripture. By countering racism claims through biblical realism, believers affirm that true charity begins with ordered priorities and extends through discernment rather than dissolution of distinctions. This approach safeguards communities, preserves capacity for mission, and honors the pursuit of heavenly reward through responsible obedience. In an era of global connectivity, it offers the deeper, more intelligent expression of faith that sustains rather than depletes the sources of genuine compassion.